Good evening, my friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 9 of the laws of Shabbat. And we're going to be learning about a number of things. The Rambam is in the middle of explaining us about the 39 prime labors that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Today we're going to be learning a couple of these. So he starts off by telling us that on Shabbat we're not allowed to bake. So in general, the law is that any person who bakes the size of the amount of a dried fig, which is not very large, is going to be liable. And in other words, this applies to bread, this applies to baking any food or herbs, or even just heating up water on Shabbat. Any of these are not allowed to be done. And even to put something near the fire so that it should heat up is something which we're not allowed to do if it's raw and you want it to be cooked by that. For instance, if you want to place an egg next to a hot kettle, which is very hot, and now you put the egg next to it and it's going to get the heat and ultimately be cooked, that's something which we're not allowed to do. Or if there are certain fish that are very, very thin and soft, and when you put them even with just hot water, they become cooked, and that makes them ready to eat. So that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. But to take an egg and pour it onto a boiling hot sidewalk or a hood of a car, that on Shabbat, technically speaking, would be allowed because it's the heat of the sun and it's not the heat of a pot, of a fire, which is different in Jewish law. But the rabbi said that since we don't want that a person should cook in that way and then end up maybe by mistake cooking by regular or by fire, so therefore they also said that we're not allowed to cook even by the heat of the sun on Shabbat. What about a case where you have a few people where one brings the fire, another brings the wood, another brings the pot, another brings the water, another puts in the meat, another puts in the spices, and then another one stirs it. So in other words, many different people are all part of this, and each one does one thing. So then they would all be liable because they're all taking part in this creation of this cooking or this baking. Now, but if it's a different case, where one person brings a pot and he puts it down, then another person comes and he sees this pot and he puts in a piece of meat. Then another person comes and he sees that there is a piece of meat in a pot and he adds water. And then another person comes and adds spices to it. And then another person comes and lights the fire, and another person comes and will stir it. Only the last two will be liable, because the person who lit the fire and the person who stirs it are the only ones who are actually cooking. The first ones are just doing an action, but it's not in part of the actual cooking. In the original case, they were all doing it together. So then that's different. But in the case where it's just each one individually doing one action, only the last two, the people who actually cook, are going to be liable. Now, what about if a person takes a piece of meat, good steak, and he puts it on top of the coals on Shabbat? And now, a portion of this meat gets cooked. And then he's like, oh my God, it's Shabbat. So, and he pulls it off. So even if just a little piece, if it's the size of a dried fig, is already cooked, then that's already, a person is going to be liable. And, if it's by mistake, you would have to bring a sacrifice and so on. But if there is not a portion of any part of, there's no, even in combination, there is not enough meat that was actually cooked. So then, even if it was half cooked, still a person, if the entire piece of meat was half cooked, so still one would be liable. But if it was only half cooked from one side, not on both sides of the meat, so then the person would be okay. We're not allowed to do it, obviously, but in a case where the person does it, the person would not be liable. Same thing if a person stuck a loaf of bread into the oven, or back in the olden days, they would stick their breads onto the walls of the oven that were very hot. There were these pancakes that they would stick onto the walls. So in such a case, if a person remembers, oh my God, it's Shabbat, and he pulls it out before it's cooked, so then it's fine. Now, as part of the idea of cooking on Shabbat, which we're not allowed to do, we're also not allowed to melt anything in the heat. In other words, we're not allowed to take a piece of metal and put it into the heat so it would melt or become soft and so on. Or wax and so on and so forth. Tar. All of these are derivatives of cooking, and we're not allowed to do them. Similarly, the same idea. Also, if a person has earthenware, which need heat so that it should become hard, that's also something which we're not allowed to do. The bottom line is like this. The Rambam says, the general principle is whenever someone softens a firm entity with fire or hardens a soft entity, then they would also be liable for cooking. So that's the idea of cooking in short, or baking as well, which the Rambam discusses in this chapter. Now he moves on to another topic, another law. In regards to cutting, a person is not allowed to cut on Shabbat. So a person is not allowed to shear wool or hair from an animal. And whether the animal is alive or the animal is dead, doesn't matter. In any case, we're not allowed to cut. Except for in a case of cooking, not cooking, but preparing food to be eaten for Shabbat. To cut a salad, you're allowed to cut, but you're not allowed to shear on Shabbat. So how much does a person have to actually cut in order to be liable? So he says it's the amount, it's very interesting the way he counts it. He says the amount of length that is from a person's thumb till their index finger. So it's this much space amount that they have to cut. Person tears something, so since this is a derivative of shearing, so if they tear off, he says in the case a person tears off the wing of a bird, so then again that would also not be allowed to be done. It's not allowed to be done on Shabbat. Now, in regards to a person taking care of themselves, for instance, to cut their nails, their hair, a man to cut his mustache or his beard. So all of these are shearing, cutting, and we're not allowed to be done. And that's and the person would only be liable in a case where they actually use a utensil. In other words, they use a nail clipper, they use a knife or a scissor or whatever. But in a case where a person just uses their hand, so then they would not be liable, but it's not allowed to be done. Now in the temple, there's a very interesting law. In the temple, many of these rabbinic laws or essentially all rabbinic laws were not, so to speak, in action. In other words, in the temple, they were doing things only according to the actual biblical law, because the Kohanim were very on par, so to speak, and they had many of them working together. And in the temple, it was a special rule that they were keeping to the base biblical law in regards to Shabbat. So therefore, in a case where a person had a wart, so under Shabbat, we're not allowed to cut a wart. In the temple, if a person had a wart, they weren't allowed to work in the temple. But if a person had a dried out wart, so on Shabbat, so if they had this wart, so they wouldn't be allowed to work. But if they cut it off, then they would be allowed to work. So in the temple, since it was dried off, so then it would not be classified as a regular wart, and they would be allowed to cut it off in the temple. But it's just in general. This is something which I'm mentioning over here. The Rambam mentions it over here, but it's an important thing to realize that the certain restrictions and the prohibitions that the rabbis had put into place, extra, as an extra boundary above the basic biblical law, that in the temple was. They were allowed to not follow those. In other words, they went only according to the biblical law. So that's just an interesting thing to point out. How much does a person have to cut their hair in order to be liable on Shabbat? The Rambam says 2 hairs. It's not a lot. And if they were removing gray hairs from their dark ones, I'm getting old, my God, I cut out this piece of hair. So then even if it's just one hair, they would already be liable. And what about if a person's fingernail, sometimes it happens that so we're not allowed to cut our nails on Shabbat. But what happens if a person's fingernail cut off on its own, and now it's hanging off, and it's really annoying? So the Rambam says, in such a case, you're allowed to pull it off. But you're not allowed to use a nail clipper for it. But if it doesn't disturb you, so then don't. And if it's not mostly off, just a little bit, so then leave it on and don't pull it off. So that's the idea of cutting on Shabbat, which we're not allowed to do. Now we're going to talk a little bit about washing, whitening. So in other words, to whiten wool, linen, or dyeing, coloring a certain item, that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Laundering is the same idea. It's whitening the clothes. It's getting rid of any dirt within it to get it nice and clean. That's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And now, there's another idea which we're not allowed to squeeze on Shabbat. And when we squeeze clothing with water, essentially it's cleaning them. So that's something which we're not allowed to do because it's part of laundry. But in regards to hair, if your hair gets wet, if it's raining or whatever, you're allowed to squeeze out the water from your hair on Shabbat because that's not part of squeezing. Squeezing would only apply to a certain material which has absorbed water, and now you're squeezing out the water from within it. But in regards to hair or skin, that would not, or leather, for instance, that would not be counted as squeezing. All right. Now, what about a person who wants to beat wool? In other words, if you have wool which is very thick and you want to beat it down or to comb it down to get it nice and smooth, that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat as well. And as we said it before, a person is not allowed to dye on Shabbat. Dye as in color a piece of material to change its color on Shabbat, something which we're not allowed to do. And we're not actually even allowed to make dye on Shabbat. But if it's a person that, if you're just taking something which, you take a certain material like red clay, let's say, and you push it and you color something with it. So even though because it's not something which is permanent, it's just, if it rains or if you wash it off, it's going to come off eventually. So then a person will not be liable, but we're not allowed to do it because essentially you are changing its color on Shabbat, even though it's not something permanent. But the general idea is that in regards to something which is not permanent, a person will not be liable. But if it is something which is permanent, then that's counted as actual dyeing, and that's something which we're definitely not allowed to do. Let's moving on to the next idea, is regards to spinning thread. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. And over here, he's in the last couple laws of this chapter, the Rambam discusses the whole idea of sewing and spinning threads and so on and so forth. So all of these are something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat, whether it's threading, whether it's weaving, whether it's sewing. All of these we're not allowed to do. And there are various details in where he discusses exactly what we're not allowed to do. We're not allowed to spin wool, linen, so on and so forth. Any animal sinus and or any other fiber of hair or of any of this nature, we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. We're not allowed to make felt on Shabbat. And a person who makes two heddles is liable. And heddles, as I was trying to figure out what this means, is basically, it seems that there were two frames that they would use. One was for the warp, and one was for the roof. Warp and woof. So there were these two frames, and one, the strings were going this way, one they were going this way. And one horizontal, one vertical, and they would throw this string through it, and then it would somehow it would connect each other, and that's how they would make material. That's from what I have understood. It could be I'm wrong, but that's the general idea. So that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And in general, we're not allowed to make fabric. We're not allowed to take threads, connect them, set them out, to set out one way and then put in the other strings that go the other way, the warp or the woof. Any way we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And so anyone who extends the threads, so to speak, that's what it's called, mounting the warp, is something which we're not allowed to do. In general, weaving two threads together is something which is not allowed to be done on Shabbat. We are creating something new. We're creating a piece of material. That's something which we should not do on Shabbat. Now, what happens in a case where a person actually pulls apart a thread? So in other words, if you have a piece of material and now you pull it apart. So if you're trying to destroy the garment, so then it's all right. I don't think you should do it, but if it's done, I don't think it's not the end of the world. But a person who pulls apart a garment, pulls out, some of the strings, some of the fabric, and now, in order to connect it to another piece of material, so essentially they're removing parts of it in order to be able to make it into a new garment. So that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. It's called botseya, which basically means separation. So we're not allowed to separate woven fabric on Shabbat in order to enhance it. And that is pretty much the chapter of today, where we learned a number of different laws of Shabbat which we're not allowed to do, various labors. That is the chapter of today. We will see you all tomorrow.